Welcome to Beneath the Bible, where we're helping you dig deeper and uncover the world beneath the sacred book. Have you ever wondered what God's plan was for your life? What does God want you to do? Well, you're in luck. You can go to Amazon right now and buy any number of books and Bible studies that'll help you explore that topic. Easy as that, right? But what did they do in the ancient world if they wanted to know what God wanted them to do? Well, they would practice, or they would get a skilled practitioner of divination to get their answer. Today we're starting a series on divination in the Bible and the ancient world. Divination was a collection of practices to discern the will of the gods through various means. Now, this series actually started with a viewer question about the ephod, a special article of clothing worn by Israel's high priest and used for divination. Now, there is so much to cover on this topic that we couldn't just talk about the ephod. So over the next few weeks, we're going to explore divination in the ancient world in general, and then we'll look at some divination practices: casting lots, the ephod and teraphim, and finally the Urim and Tumim, which were apparently stored in the ephod. Be sure to subscribe so you don't miss any videos in this series. Now, the ancient Israelites had an interesting relationship with divination. Now, you might think all forms of divination were banned in Israel, but there are actually some forms of divination that were acceptable and others that were not. The forms of divination we'll explore in this series were generally accepted or sanctioned in ancient Israel. We've also done a video on necromancy and Saul's visit to the witch of Endor, a practice that was definitely unacceptable in ancient Israel. So, how was divination practiced in the ancient world, and how did these practices influence the Israelites? Let's dig in. Divination is a category of activities that are used to determine the will of the divine. We're going to focus on divination in the ancient Near East because that's what we know best. But almost every culture around the world practices some kind of divination. We're just going to look at the practices around ancient Israel to see the context in which we see Israel's divinatory practices taking place. Now, the premise of divination is that our world, what we might call the natural world, and the supernatural world are interrelated. And more than interrelated, they're actually inextricably linked. So what happens in one realm impacts the other. One scholar talks about this in the sense of connectedness. Now, you probably know Newton's third law of motion. For every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. Or you might say there's a first law of divination. All divine action causes material reaction. So because of the interconnectedness of the natural and supernatural worlds, divine action has consequences that are evident in the material world, if you know what to look for.
One Mesopotamian text states, "The signs of the earth together with those of the sky produce a signal. Heaven and earth both bring us portents, each separately but not different, since sky and earth are interconnected. A sign that is evil in the sky is evil on earth. A sign that is evil on earth is evil in the sky." In this understanding of the cosmos, the gods could speak to people whenever and however they wished. The gods could, in a sense, write their communication in the natural world, and that writing could manifest in signs and events that those attuned to and trained to divine symbols could interpret. Texts like the one we just cited were written so that practitioners could record and develop their divinatory specializations, lists of signs and events with their likely interpretations. Most of our divination texts come from Mesopotamia, like these, which have actually been described as Mesopotamian diviners' manuals. When we dig into some of this literature, we can see numerous kinds of divination were practiced in the ancient Near East. So this is a pretty big field with a pretty big body of literature, so I'll just hit some of the highlights here. The first and most obvious kind of divination is prophecy. Prophecy was often conducted by court prophets. They were employed by the kings of the ancient Near East, and it was their job to determine and understand the will of the gods for the benefit of the king. Other prophecy was more informal. It came in ecstatic visions or dreams to the powerful and the commoner alike. Texts from Mari record such ecstatic prophetic encounters. Now, another kind of divination was actually dreams. The late 3rd millennium king Gudea of Lugal records how he sought out divine help in a dream before he set about building a temple. This kind of dream was called an incubation dream and was where an individual slept in a sacred place or somehow sought out a dream with prophetic implications. Other people could, in the normal course of their lives, have dreams that were sent from the gods and needed interpretation, because if the gods deigned to talk to you, you should probably figure out what message they were trying to communicate. Archaeologists have actually recovered numerous texts devoted to dream interpretation that usually take the form of conditional if-then statements. If the dream has this in it, then the dream means this. Some of these interpretations are pretty logical and make a bit of sense, but others really don't seem to make any sense, at least not to me. But then again, I'm not particularly skilled at divination. Other kinds of divination are what may be called deductive divination. These kinds of divination were instigated by the divine realm just as prophecy and dreams were, but they were sent via observable signs. These things include all kinds of omens, like reading bird patterns, or clouds, or arrows, scrying, star signs, necromancy, surprise encounters, and on and on and on and on. Setting aside the issue of astrology for the time being, the best examples include things like extispicy and the casting of lots. These are both examples where the divine is provoked and an answer is sought. In fact, extispicy was often used to check other kinds of divination and omens. You may read omens one way, but if you wanted to make sure, you would seek an answer in extispicy. The premise of extispicy is that you could ask the gods a question, usually a yes or no question, which was typically whispered in the ear of the sacrificial animal right before it was slaughtered. The answer would be written on the exta of the animal, usually but by no means exclusively on the liver. The diviner would examine the organs and the various omens on the exta, usually after slaughter and dissection was done in a set order and manner. Each organ and parts of each organ had many possible interpretations, so the final answer was kind of a summation of the signs, and how that tabulation was managed isn't entirely clear. Answers could be affirmative, negative, or uncertain, in which case typically a new animal was brought and it was retried. Now, there are many texts, particularly from the Library of Ashurbanipal, like these, that are extispicy texts. They instruct the practitioner how to properly purify an animal, how to read the exta, and so on. There are even model sheep livers that have inscriptions on them that were for extispicy, an ancient cheat sheet of sorts. Now, this practice continued from at least the Old Babylonian period, where a lot of the rules and procedures were established, and continued well into the Roman period. Scrying is the practice of peering into the surface of a particular object or material to get a message or vision from it. This is popular even today. Looking into a crystal ball to see images of the future or predictions of what is to come are examples of scrying. But the medium didn't have to be a crystal ball. Smoke, mirrors, fire, water, and many other media are used for scrying. In the ancient world, though, oil drops on water were the most common type of scrying. Texts from Mesopotamia describe how to get oil omens. The diviner typically sat with a bowl or cup between their legs, they faced north or east, and was best done at sunrise. The omen would be determined based on how the oil was colored or moved, or how it merged with other drops, and by the shape of the oil made on the water, among many other factors. Finally, casting lots was also widely practiced in the ancient world, and this required less expertise to understand. Lots would be put in a container and shaken until a lot came out. Thus, it could be assured the divine drew the lot, not a human. Things like these dice could also be used as lots, but they didn't have to be dice, because we even see in the Bible lots being used that aren't dice. We'll look at casting lots in a lot more detail next week.
Now, those of you who are familiar with the Bible may recognize several places where some of these types of divination are present, though you maybe hadn't thought of it at all in the broader context of divination. And when we dive into some of the biblical data, we see some kinds of divination were accepted and even encouraged, while others were not. Now, first and most obviously, prophecy was practiced in ancient Israel. Prophets like Ezekiel and Amos were common people who had ecstatic visions or direct words from God. We also see court prophets in the Bible. Ahab and Jezebel hired court prophets, but in this case the prophets served Baal, not Yahweh. David had a court prophet named Nathan. After David's affair with Bathsheba and his order to have her husband killed in battle, Nathan told David the parable of the rich man who took from the poor man to illustrate the wrongdoing that David had committed. He told David what God wanted and what God did not approve of, essentially what is at the heart of divination. The Bible also includes many famous stories involving dreams. We can see a parallel in Solomon's dream to the story of Gudea seeking divine guidance. In the story, Solomon goes to Gibeon, explicitly stated as one of the most holy places, and sacrifices there. Only then did God appear to him in a dream. This seems to be Solomon purposely seeking divine guidance in a dream. Joseph had dreams which told the future. He and Daniel both interpreted dreams, and both for foreign kings. Joseph interpreted an unnamed Pharaoh's dreams and said that he couldn't interpret it, but God will give Pharaoh the answer he desires. Daniel also praises God for revealing to him in a vision the king's dream and its meaning. Daniel tells the king, "No wise man, enchanter, magician, or diviner can explain to the king the mystery he has asked about, but there is a God in heaven who reveals mysteries." In Israel and Judah, it seems dreams were seen as a lesser form of communication from God. Jeremiah seems to denigrate those who have a prophecy from a dream as opposed to the way Jeremiah prophesied. Now, clearly, God could speak through dreams, but the prophets thought God spoke better or more fully in other ways, namely through them, through the prophets. Joseph even seems to have practiced scrying, or at least he wanted his brothers to think so. In Genesis 44, Joseph meets his brothers many years after they sold him into slavery in Egypt. Before they realize he's their brother, he sends them on their way back to their father Jacob in Canaan, and he fills their sacks with grain. He also sticks his silver cup in his brother Benjamin's bag. Then he sends his servant to catch up with them and says, "Why have you repaid good with evil? Isn't this the cup my master drinks from and also uses for divination? This is a wicked thing you have done." Now, the divination here is probably meant to be understood as scrying, probably looking at oil omens. Many forms of divination are banned in the Bible. But often when something is banned in the Bible, the ban is in place because it was at least occasionally practiced. Deuteronomy 18 is pretty clear about not practicing types of divination and witchcraft that were practiced by the surrounding Canaanites. Things like casting spells, necromancy, witchcraft, interpreting omens, and general divination are all banned. Exodus likewise bans witchcraft in Exodus 22, as well as sorcery. In this case, the word is feminine, so it specifically bans female practitioners, but it seems to be generally banning the practice of divinatory magic. Leviticus also has a general ban on divination and omens. Now, finally, I think there are some interesting things to explore around the practice of ecstasy in the Bible. Ecstasy is not condoned in the Bible, though they were obviously familiar with it from the people groups around them. Ezekiel alludes to it in reference to the king of Babylon. Now, interestingly, it also seems to show up in Jeremiah. In Jeremiah 31, there is this verse, one that you may be familiar with. It's a fairly famous verse and one that many people hold dear. Now, these kinds of passages are taken as poetic and emotive and conjure up an image of a scribe. But the actual Hebrew here says something like, "I will put my Torah in their entrails, and I will write it on their hearts." This seems to be a reference to a kind of ecstasy in the Hebrew Bible. Now, this is, of course, how ecstasy works. The gods write answers on the exta of a sheep. Here, though, God will write his Torah on the exta of his people. That may sound poetic, but it's the practice of ecstasy that gives it literary force. So, there's our overview of divination in the ancient Near East. Now, as you can see, ancient peoples sought to discover the will of the divine in a wide variety of ways, including some that were practiced and even permissible in ancient Israel. Next week, we'll look in some more detail at a few places that we see more divinatory practices in the Bible, specifically the casting of lots. We've got a lot more in store, so make sure you like and subscribe so you can catch new episodes when they come out. Thanks for joining us for this Beneath the Bible video. If you liked what you saw, be sure to give this video a like and hit the subscribe button so you don't miss any future videos. You can also follow us on social media, on Twitter and Facebook at Beneath the Bible. If you learned something new today, take a minute to share this video with your friends. And until next time, keep digging.